Hi, my name is Ann Werda, and today we're going to talk about using mirrored assessments for growth, and I'm going to give you a brief introduction to this process. I think a lot of districts are facing a very serious challenge right now looking at ways they can create or adapt assessments to measure student growth over time. The goal really here is to get a numeric representation of learning. That means to get a number that can represent change in student understanding over time. Mathematically, we're looking at 2 or more data points in order to do this. So at minimum, we need to have a baseline assessment, for example, followed by some sort of a summative or post-test. And then we would look at the difference between those 2 points to determine how much learning has occurred in that student. Mathematically, we could look at baselines compared to summative assessments, look at individual student growth, and even create a trajectory or a linear regression looking at the typical growth and comparing students from any given sample cohort to what typical growth would be and looking at whether students are making typical growth on that particular assessment set. So our tool in this process is going to be a high quality assessment set, which means more than one mirrored assessment, 2 or more. 2 is the minimum mathematical requirement to be able to do this. So we know that growth is not attainment. Attainment would be a single data point. We're quite used to talking about attainment in education, like for example on a final exam. We know what a student scored on that final based on the information that they were able to demonstrate they understood on that given day. Growth is going to be different because growth is not looking at just what information they knew on the final exam, but they would be looking at how much more information that is as compared to some point previously in time, typically at the beginning of the instructional interval. So we'd be looking at how much information a student knew at the beginning of the instructional interval compared to how much information that student knew later on in the instructional interval. So the question really becomes is how do we create valid and reliable assessments to measure this change in understanding? How can teachers create or choose assessments that can really quantify change in student understanding? And by quantify, we really mean putting a number on student growth. And that's really what we need to do for the evaluation system. We need to talk about it in a very concrete way. So we need to say that a student has grown in their understanding by a certain amount, in which we would typically attribute to a number. Like, for example, they scored 10 points higher than they did before, or maybe 50% higher than they did on a pretest. So in order to do this, we need to design 2 assessments that are similar and comparable. And typically we look at mirrored assessments being similar in features such as their form, their content, and their complexity. Let's look at each element real quickly. The form, the content rather is looking at what skills and standards. So we're making the 2 tests about comparable topics. The form would be it's multiple choice compared to multiple choice, for example, or performance compared to performance. So you're keeping the form consistent and you're being intentional about that form. And then finally, the level of complexity. You would obviously not want to give the students a very difficult exam at the beginning or a difficult question at the beginning and follow it up with an easy question and assume that the students have grown when in reality they just had an easier question. So we want to make sure that the difficulty level, the form, and the content or the skills of the assessments in a mirrored set where we're measuring growth remain the same. Now, one thing I think that's really important to address is that mirrored assessments are not identical. Mirroring is really creating assessments in parallel, but they're not exact copies. And the reason is that by using 2 exact questions twice is really unintentionally assessing recall rather than assessing their ability to perform those particular skills. And what we don't want to do is we don't want to unintentionally assess anything. We want to be very intentional about the data we're getting back from these particular results. We really can look at 3 different reasons that I think are the primary reasons why we want to stay away from identical questions on a skill. First of all, students are going to remember seeing the same question twice. I think we shouldn't underestimate our students. They have good memories. Even a kindergartner is going to recognize the same question if you repeat it. Repeating the identical question and then assuming that the students won't remember that it's identical, I think is a little unreasonable. The second one, and I think this is a very powerful piece, is the teachable moment that we get through using mirrored questions. Piaget, amongst other constructivists, has talked quite a bit about the moment of questioning and disequilibrium it being the moment of a student's desire to create new learning. And our job as teachers really is to capitalize on these moments. And when the student has that moment where they say, I wonder, then our job as teachers is to sweep in and help them to understand. And so when we present an assessment with information that the students do not know, and quite frankly, that is what a baseline assessment is going to be, is information the students don't know, it's an awesome teachable moment to be able to use that to say, let's talk about why you got this wrong. Or maybe a week or two down the line, when you're explaining how to do the problem, you can reference that initial assessment. So using it as a teaching tool as we go through the lessons related to that particular skill. And then finally, there's the issue of validity. Valid results really mean that the assessment results we're getting measure what we intend them to measure. And what we're intending to measure is understanding of a skill or a topic. So we want to make sure we're getting valid data. Really, when we give the same question twice, the validity of the data really does come into question because, first of all, student effort can be potentially affected. We will see students that will try harder or not as hard if they're realizing it's the exact same test that they've seen before. Student answer choices can also be influenced by their previous selection. So, for example, if you haven't gone over that particular problem, but they're seeing the exact problem before, they might guess that they got it wrong, and so they may not choose the exact same answer because they remember choosing that answer in the past. And so what's going to happen is their choice is not going to be purely based on their skill, but their choice will be influenced based on what they think they remember or what they actually do remember about taking the assessment before. And finally, it's really going to be highly likely that students, especially our more conscientious individuals, are going to look up or talk about questions. They will talk to their peers or find out answers by looking to someone else. So if the teacher does not use that as a teachable moment, there are plenty of students who are going to use it as a moment for themselves and go and look up some of the questions and then know the answer going into seeing it the second time, which was obviously make the data completely invalid. So even if you have a mirrored assessment that you don't discuss with the students, the validity could become into question if the assessment is identical. Now, there are cases where a question could potentially be identical. These are going to be your recall or memorization questions. For example, if you're trying to assess 3 times 3, there's only so many ways you can ask the student how to multiply a particular math fact, or how to state the definition of a vocabulary word, or a sight word, or a Spanish vocabulary word. These sorts of recall and memorization things, they are justifiable to have the identical question. However, I think we know about balanced assessments that no assessment should be 100% recall. So if the entire assessment is memorizing facts, it's probably not a balanced assessment. A balanced assessment has appropriate amounts of questions at every level of cognitive demand, and so it's reflective of the cognitive demand that's happening in the classroom. So most classrooms don't revolve around 100% recall, therefore those assessments should not be 100% recall either. Most classrooms have a variety of questions at, the apply and analyze level or even the evaluate and create level. Therefore, the assessments should have a spectrum of cognitive demand that's representative of the work that the students are doing in that class. So therefore, there should be skill assessment questions that would not be recall and therefore should not be identical. Now, I think it's worth knowing that as we're in the age of assessment, we could literally be assessing our students constantly. And so it's important to consider the time that we give up every time we administer an assessment. Every time we administer an assessment, we are losing instructional time. And I think it's important to consider if the data that we're getting from administering that assessment is more valuable than the instructional time we're losing. And more valuable data will be data that can help us to be better teachers. In other words, help us to have a better understanding of our students, help us to have an understanding of what instructional techniques are working and what instructional techniques are not working. And so designing high quality assessments that will get us data that will help us to understand what's working and what's not working will actually be more useful use of our students' time and our time as teachers when we grade those assessments. So I think we need to think about what kind of data we want when we put together an assessment and we choose what kind of questions are going to go onto that assessment. With a good high-quality test, we want data that can show change in student understanding over time or growth. And this is going to be growth on our key essential skills and ways that we can demonstrate sustained growth in student learning. We also want an assessment that's going to give us information about what's working and what's not working. This will help prove effectiveness of our instructional methods, and even through a distractor analysis, we can get ideas of what misconceptions the students have and how they're making mistakes, and what we can do as instructors to improve student understanding. Finally, we should be getting data that can inform our pivot points. Pivot points are times within your lessons where you do exactly like you would in a basketball game. You look at the lay of the court and you make your next move. So you determine how you're going to differentiate, what upcoming lesson plans you're going to need, and how you're going to help to students to reach the goals and learn the information that you're intending them to learn in that particular unit. So as we bring growth to our data picture, I think we're all very aware that on the evaluation, certain percent of it is going to be raw student growth information. So these assessment sets that we're creating, we're going to be looking at those contributing to our evaluation as we determine how much growth students display. However, a preponderant portion of our evaluation remains the professional responsibility. In the professional responsibility section, we're looking at 75 or 70% at maximum, and being different areas of teacher reflectiveness, using your assessment in the instruction, reflecting on what needs the students have and being responsive to student need, and designing coherent instruction around student understanding. This portion of the evaluation, which typically is a part of the teacher's portfolio or the discussion with the evaluator, can really hinge on having high quality data from quality assessments. And so designing assessments that can give you information about what kind of needs your students have so that you can adjust your instruction to meet the needs is really going to differentiate the excellent teacher from the proficient teacher, or that level 4 teacher from the level 3 teacher. And that level 4 teacher is going to have quite a bit of information to explain how they're being reflective on their teaching and how that student growth information can be brought to their data picture. So as we create these assessments for growth and we try to make them mirrored so that we can have comparable elements, we want to focus on content, form, and complexity, as I mentioned before. And I think if you keep these three variables in mind, you can design a useful and reliable and valid assessments that measure student understanding over time and give you good information to change the way that you're teaching as a result of the information the students know.